Hello, welcome to the last webinar in our Practical Project Management Advanced series. Today we're going to talk about Agile methodologies. It's a little loud here because it's raining kind of hard, so I apologize for any extraneous noise, but we'll do our best and off we go. Now, as I usually do for anyone who hasn't been in one of my webinars before, I want to give you some information about me so you have some confidence that I know what I'm talking about. My name is Kim Wasson. My educational background is a bachelor's in computer science from Cal State and a master's in industrial engineering and engineering management from Stanford. And I have held positions from line engineer to vice president before I started consulting at companies as big as IBM and eBay and as small as brand new startups. And I have used project management tools and techniques and methodologies in every position that I've held. I started Ivy Bay Consulting 10 years ago, almost 11 now. My specialties at Ivy Bay are providing tailored solutions for project and program management, untangling difficult projects, coaching folks on project and program management and time management, and doing some process engineering and process improvement work. I work heavily with distributed and international teams. And you can learn more about me and what I do and what I've done on my website, which is www.ivybay.com. So let's get started with what we're going to talk about today. We're going to define Agile, and I'm going to give you a little background on how it came about. And we'll talk a little bit about flavors because Agile comes in many flavors. We'll cover the basic Agile concepts and processes. And we're going to talk a lot about user stories because they are a basic building block of Agile methodologies. As always, we'll walk through an example or two. And then, of course, we'll wrap up with things to remember. So here we go. Agile is a software development methodology, but it applies to just about anything. And of course, I will give you an example of something other than software that this applies to. But it is used primarily in software development companies and disciplines right now. It is expanding. It's very useful under the right circumstances, of course. Sorry about that. I'm not sure where that came from. Okay, all Agile methodologies incorporate a cyclic structure. So things move in short cycles so that you can get from point A to point B in a project quickly and in a very flexible way. And that'll make more sense as we go along. Within these little cycles, it's very structured and very controlled. But outside of the cycle, it's very flexible. So how long you work on something before you decide it's finished, how often you release it in terms of software, is all very flexible outside each cycle. What features are included, what features are excluded if they're not currently being worked on, all very flexible. So a little bit of history on Agile. If you've been following these webinars, you know that the traditional software development lifecycle process was called waterfall, and it's very structured, and it finishes one development activity completely, and it's approved before it moves on to the next. And then that spiral waterfall was developed so there was a little more feedback between the phases of a project because that made the development more efficient. In late 1999, something called extreme programming was introduced. And it was, in the software development world, pretty radical. It was in response to, remember 1999 was the big bubble. The internet was exploding, and there were a lot of bleeding edge technologies and there was a lot of crowd in the market. So things had to be developed and discarded very quickly, and waterfall was not working for it. So extreme programming was a methodology that was introduced, as I said, in late 1999. It's still used, but it formed the basis for Agile. The Agile practices are an extension of the original extreme programming concepts. There's an Agile manifesto that you can look at. It's on agilemanifesto.org that will give you the basic precepts of Agile, but they're very much based on extreme programming, which is a quick turn, cyclic, architecture light, because the architectures were changing and a lot of them were trial and error, way to go about programming. So I will tell you, before we get into Agile flavors, I was very fortunate to be running engineering at a startup in right after extreme programming was introduced to the market, when the book was published. And one of our first engineering hires was someone who had worked with the people who developed extreme programming. So I was able to use those concepts very, very early in basically their life, to be able to see what worked and what didn't. So I really do have quite a bit of experience in Agile. The definition of Agile is that it is iterative, it's time boxed, and it's very collaborative. And what happens is in each iteration, a demonstrable product is delivered. You may not want to call it finished. You may not want to send it out to a marketplace, but you have something that you can demonstrate that actually works. Scrum, you'll hear a lot about Scrum. Scrum is a specific flavor of Agile. It is not the Agile methodology. It's a very specific flavor. It has its own additional terminology, and it has some really strict rules that may or may not work for a given project, organization, or team. I have not yet worked with in a situation where straight Scrum actually is the best choice for me. And you'll hear a lot about Kanban, which is not Agile, but it's in the same family of methodologies. It's called a lean methodology. It came out of Japan and auto manufacturing. It limits the amount of work in process, and it does that by type of work, by activity, whereas Agile limits the work in process in a time frame. So they are different, and they can actually be used together. So let's talk about the concepts in Agile. The first one is an iteration. That's a development cycle that's fixed length. It can be any length. I have used everything between a week and 4 weeks, which is actually what straight Scrum calls for. And I have found that a week carries too much overhead with the process, generally, depending on the project. And I have found that 4 weeks tends to be too long, and people try to do a lot of changing within the iteration, and it kind of defeats the whole purpose of using Agile. So for most of the projects I have worked on with Agile, the iterations are 2 or 3 weeks. In Scrum, iterations are called sprints. The thing about iterations in an Agile process is they are all the same size. If you have a 2-week iteration, it is a 2-week iteration. You don't do 2 weeks this time and 3 weeks next time and a week the time after that. Obviously, if you are working on, say, a 2-week iteration and it turns out that it is just not workable for you because your pieces of stuff are too big, or because it's not putting out releasable products frequently enough, then you change it, but you change it and you keep the change. So iterations do not move. You don't extend them. They are what they are. They are a fixed period of time. And a user story is the other major building block in Agile, and that is a single functional unit of work. In the software world, that's typically an enhancement or a bug fix. And sometimes these are called story cards. That's a holdover from extreme programming, where actually index cards were used for this, and they were taped to a wall or pinned to a board. And you'll see that kind of an interface still sometimes in the tools. But a user story is the main unit of work. And then you'll hear about epics. Epics are super user stories, so they're a container for other user stories. So for example, let's go back to our long-time best example of this, and that is you're building a piece of software that deals with customers as part of the piece of software. And as part of that, you want to have to be able to create a customer, you want to be able to edit a customer, you want to be able to delete a customer, you want to be able to view a customer, and maybe you want to be able to print a customer. And in any iterative methodology, you're going to do probably create first. You're going to do one of those first so you can see what it looks like, and make changes to the definition of the other ones without actually having to change any code. But all of those might go under an epic called customer processing, so that you can gather them, so that you can look at where you are with respect to customer processing when you're making decisions. But they don't necessarily all go in the same iteration. They don't all have to be done per the process to release a product. It could be that, per your market definition, you do have to finish all the user stories in an epic for a process, but there's nothing in the Agile methodology that requires that. And then there's the backlog, and that's a list of everything that you're not working on right now. You haven't started them yet. You haven't started these user stories yet. And that could be very big or very small. And in all flavors of Agile, there is a daily stand-up meeting. It's called a stand-up meeting because there's not time to sit down. It needs to be 15 minutes or less. All the members of the team are there, and you go around the room. Each team member says, this is assuming it's at the end of the day. You can see that there are some adjustments if you're doing it at the beginning of the day, but they say, each person says, what I did yesterday, what I will do today, and what blockers or issues or needs I have. In this 15-minute meeting, no one tries to resolve the issues. However, people are assigned to go help deal with it. And usually you don't need assignments. This is a very collaborative process. Usually people will just step up and say, let's go work on that after the meeting. So that's it. Everybody goes around. So you can see that there is a constant status being given. Everyone on the team knows what everyone else is doing every day. There are some, initially there were co-location requirements, which are very, very useful if it's possible. If everybody is in the same physical location, actually Agile calls for everybody to be in the same room. And I have been in situations where that's actually possible, and it's really useful. That means in a software company, your product manager is sitting there with QA, with the developers, with usually even with management, so that there is a constant collaboration. Everyone knows what's going on all the time. That's not necessarily possible in a lot of situations where we have largely widely distributed teams, international teams. We're working across time zones. We have a lot of telecommuting. There are ways around that, but co-location was an initial requirement of Agile. Story points, which are really a more recent development but are extremely useful. It's a rough estimate of effort required to implement a user story. That means that you don't have to know a whole lot about the user story to give one of these rough estimates. There are a lot of scales for story points. I like to use 1 to 5. And that's really, you can see with 1 to 5, that's an order of magnitude. And that's really, what you need to know to make a decision about how to prioritize something you haven't started yet. And you'll see a lot about velocity. That's the number of whatever, depending on what you're counting, user stories, story points, estimated hours. How many are completed per iteration? It's an average. It's kind of a running average, and that helps you set up your iterations with the right amount of stuff in them in general. At the end of each iteration, you have a wrap-up meeting. And what happens in a wrap-up meeting is you demonstrate new functionality. You discuss any process issues that you've run into, and you talk about any process changes that you're going to make. You also figure out what's going to happen with any user stories that were in your iteration and weren't finished. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. And then at the beginning of each iteration is a kickoff meeting. And during that meeting, you pull the right number of user stories from the top of the backlog based on your velocity. You review your velocity. You assign folks sometimes to work on some of the user stories. Typically what you want to do, unless there are really extreme areas of specialty, is people pull them off the top and work on them in priority order, right? That's why you have priorities, and priorities do not change within an iteration during that iteration. They are fixed. So you want to get the top priorities worked on first. And then you talk about blockers and issues and assign people to go work on those. In a lot of cases, your wrap-up meeting and kickoff meeting are the same ones. And I can usually accomplish a wrap-up and kickoff meeting in an hour for an iteration that only runs 2 weeks or 3 weeks. I have been in situations where, in startups where the whole company is part of the team, where the wrap-up meeting is pretty quick, but the kickoff meeting takes half a day. Whether you want your kickoff meeting to take half a day or not really depends on your situation. If that's a reasonable trade-off, if you get so much done in that meeting that the rest of your iteration just flows, then great. If it's a lot of people talking about things that really don't belong in a kickoff meeting, then you need to rearrange it so that it works correctly. And then you'll see burn down charts, which really are just how much work have I finished based on how much is in the iteration. So let's talk about components. We talked a little bit about co-location of team members. Once you start an iteration, it's fixed. The user stories that are in there stay in there. No other user stories get added to the iteration, and they stay in the order, the priority order that they're in, and they need to be worked on in that priority order. The backlog can be played with constantly because no one is actually working on any of those. And that's one of the great things about this. As market conditions change, as you learn more during an iteration, as competitive landscape changes, you could change that backlog. So when you queue up for the next iteration, you got the most recent information at your fingertips. In the software world, bugs and features are both user stories. You just prioritize them in with each other. Now, functional specifications for software are an interesting question. The process really calls for you need to be able to explain everything in your user story. I have found that depending on the complexity of the project and the knowledge of the team members and how closely the team members communicate, can often lead to results that are not what was intended. So use caution when you're going to use functional specifications. What I often implement is a rule that says if the user story can be explained clearly and totally in 3 sentences or less, you don't need a functional specification. Everything is right there. But if it's more complicated than that, then you need a functional specification. That's often the way I go. Your mileage may vary. Functional specifications really are not accounted for in Agile, but practically often I find that they are required. And then you want to estimate the backlog. If you have a very large backlog, you may not want to estimate all of it. But you want to have the top, you want to take your velocity. So if your velocity, say, is 10 user stories per iteration, we're going to work with that instead of story points, but it works the same however you're measuring your velocity. You want to have at least an iteration and a half worth of user stories estimated in the backlog so that you can load your backlog appropriately and forecast correctly. And then QA is handled in a number of ways. Initially, what I saw mostly was that development would finish an iteration, hand off the iteration to QA, and QA would spend the following iteration testing what was handed to them. That is less and less the case, and it's definitely not as efficient as as having QA being with the development engineers in a software development environment and actually testing as the engineers finish the code. So really what you want to do is decide early on what direction you're going to take for QA and stick with it for long enough to decide if it's working for you. And then dependencies are as much a part of Agile as they are any other methodology. You need to define them clearly. They're even more important in an Agile methodology because if you put something into an iteration and find partway through that it has a dependency that's not in the iteration, you're behind. You don't get to finish either of them because you can't bring new things into an iteration after it starts. So dependencies are very important. It's important to clearly define them. Most of the available software for tracking Agile has accommodation for dependencies. And then change management, usually I don't implement change management until I find it's necessary because with a 2-week development cycle or 3-week or even 4-week, you shouldn't really be having to change what's going on in there. That's the whole point of Agile. In some environments, they are just crisis-driven, and you got to be able to accommodate that. And once that starts happening to you, you need to have a methodology that makes it difficult enough that there's a big barrier to entry to changing, but that you can change if you get the right approvals and somebody can actually cross the barrier to entry, that they actually meet all of those, and there really is a crisis and you really do need to change. As always, the process needs to serve the business, right? If the process doesn't serve the business, you're better off not having it because it's impeding it. So you need to just do what's practical for your project and for your team. Well, this is a little difficult to see. I'm sorry. This is an agile iteration flow. And what it basically is telling you here is there's an iteration meeting, and then these are the activities by group in a software development shop. So I'll just read them off to you. I'm sorry that they're not very legible in this program. But developers are implementing functionality, fixing bugs, creating user documentation, doing design code and unit tests, delivering the build. If you have a product manager, whoever is handling the vision for whatever you're building, they may create, they may add to the backlog, and they're going to prioritize the backlog. If you have UI designers, they're going to be creating the UI, of course. And that's another thing like QA, where you kind of have to figure out what's going to work for your project and for your team. Let's talk a bit about project managers. Scrum calls for Scrum Masters. Scrum Masters are not project managers. Scrum Masters police the process. They make sure that everyone is doing the right thing according to the process. And unless you have really a self-directed work team, you usually do still need a project manager, and I call them Agile project managers. They are not Scrum Masters, and they perform the same kind of function that project managers provide anywhere, right? They make sure that the trains are running on time. They make sure that everything is getting done. They have their heads up. They look at the big picture. They assess risk. They do all of this stuff that really is not accounted for specifically in the Agile methodology. And then down here we have QA who are testing. They're either testing the prior iteration and creating test cases for the one that the iteration that's being built now, or they are creating test cases and testing along with development, which is much more the case at this point. And here it is by roles. That's pretty much the same kind of thing. If you like swim charts. Here's how a user story usually comes in. Whatever in the software world is usually a ticket, but it doesn't really matter. Something is created. Something that says a requirement is created. And that requirement is broken into user stories. And a lot of times, if you have a project manager, that's who's going to be breaking it into user stories. And then it goes into the backlog. And there's some estimates made. As I've said, the most efficient way to do that is in story points, but usually in the course of making an estimate, some clarifications and assumptions are ironed out. And when it's at the top and prioritized at the top, it's assigned to the next iteration. Development engineer picks it up along with the QA engineer. This is our more, and actually this happens, the timeline may be a little different depending on whether QA is an iteration behind, but still someone's going to pick it up. And then the tasks. Every user story can have multiple tasks. So for a user story, you might have design, code, unit test, create test plan, test, and you may have bug fixing before the user story is declared complete if you have QA working alongside the developer. So you can have those individual tasks. Not all software supports tasks, but most of it does at this point. And then the user story is implemented and tested, and then it's delivered. And that's pretty much what happens with the user story. So one of the more complicated pieces of Agile is figuring out how to break a request into user stories. So it needs to hang together to form a whole. In the software world, for example, you don't have a user story for one field on the screen. Right, so in this customer entry, you don't have a user story for customer name. You have a user story for create a customer. It needs to hang together and be deliverable as something that makes sense. So there's a lot of common sense involved there. You want to break your functions down into user stories that can only be worked on by one person. If more than one person could be working on a user story at the same time, then it's 2 user stories. The whole idea here is that you can get you can arrange these so that you get things done more quickly, right? That's why they're in small pieces. So if 2 people could be working on a user story, you probably need to work to break that down into 2 stories. If the story is a baseline, they're going to be similar ones, separate them. This is where the epic of customer comes in, because probably you want to implement create customer in one iteration so you can take a look at it, find out where there were poor assumptions, or it's just not working right, or need to move across the screen differently, or you forgot some information. So then you create a new user story to fix that in the next iteration, but all those other customer user stories haven't been implemented yet. So you could just fix the definition of them. And as with spiral waterfall, that's a very powerful thing to be able to do. As much as possible, a user story should fit into a single iteration. There are often 1 or 2 user stories that just aren't going to fit. They're too big. They can't be broken down further, and that is what it is. They're going to have to carry over. In general, though, if your user stories, most of your user stories are not fitting into a single iteration, either your iterations are too short or your user stories are too big. So what happens if a user story isn't finished in an iteration? There are some very specific rules for this. If work has not started, then that user story just is returned to the backlog and prioritized in wherever it now fits. That's how that works. But if a user story has started, it carries over to the next iteration as the top priority. That's the rule. The only time you wouldn't do that, again, you use your common sense. And you don't, you know, if that function is actually being thrown out, if the market's changed and suddenly this just is never going to be used, then of course you don't waste your time on it, but you're going to need a user story to undo what you've already done. So let's talk about breaking down into user stories. Let's suppose you're going to build and maintain an online customer database for a dog walking service. So this is how you make your living. You go out and you walk dogs for people, and you need to keep track of your customers. So here are some of the probable user stories that you would break this into. You want to enter the customer information. When you get a new customer, you want to put that information in. If they change their address, if they change something else, you want to edit it. You want to be able to print it. And if you're never going to use them again, you want to be able to delete them. You also probably have a concept of orders. I need, my 2 dogs walked twice a day. I'm going to be on vacation. I need my 3 dogs walked 4 times a day. Whatever it is, you also want to be able to associate an order with that customer. And then each customer might have more than 1 pet, and you probably want the profiles of the pets associated with the customers. Okay, so from the customer perspective, those things might all be in an epic, but creating the pet profiles and creating the orders, those would be different. Those wouldn't be in that epic. But knowing that you're going to probably create them and have them in the backlog in the future helps you create your dependency list, which is important no matter what process you're using. So let's assume that you can do 10 story points per iteration. So you're going to estimate those stories. There aren't very many of them. And then you're going to get started. Now we're in iteration 1. We've got our backlog. We've done a rough estimate of our user stories, and we're getting into iteration 1. So we prioritize the user stories in the backlog, and we put them into iteration 1. We're probably going to want to prioritize the rest of the backlog. We're going to figure out how we're going to test right now before we start iteration 1. We're going to figure out if we need any documentation requirements, because you really want to do that as you go along for pretty much anything, software or anything else, because after you're finished creating something, you start to lose the details as you move on to something else. So whatever documentation is required, you want to create that along the way. And then I'm going to have my kickoff meeting with my developers and QA. And then I'm going to finish that iteration. We're going to work through it. We're going to have a wrap-up meeting. We're going to set up iteration 2, which means we're going to take whatever the backlog, top user stories of the backlog are. We're going to load up 10 story points. After we do carryovers, anything that wasn't finished, we're going to put at the top. And we're going to proceed from there. And from there, it's just the same cycle over and over again. So let's try something that's not software development. Let's suppose you're a professional organizer. And you just have a new client. They want you to organize their whole house. And this is your client is a woman, and the kitchen is the first thing that she wants organized. So you've got to figure out how to do this in iterations, right? Because you don't want to have, a closet in the bedroom organized and the pantry organized and, the towels in the bathroom organized and nothing's finished. Or maybe you do, but in an iteration, you're going to say what I'm going to do. So what you decide for your iteration length is you're going to be at her house twice a month for 3 hours each time. That's your iteration, twice monthly, 3. So it's 3 hours is an iteration, right? Oops, sorry about that. Since the kitchen is your first epic, you've divided it up into these user stories. The first one is to figure out how she uses the kitchen. You're going to sort the food that's there. You're going to organize her pantry. You're going to organize the refrigerator. You're going to figure out where all the dishes are and get those organized. Same with the pots and pans. And then you have, some smaller stuff later that you're going to figure out as you go along. And that's all okay in Agile. So what you think, based on your extensive experience and the size of her kitchen and what shape it's in, is that you're going to be able to get through that in 2 of these 3-hour sessions. So that's what you start to tell her about. But after the first session, what you're finding out is that things move a little more slowly, and you're only getting through 2 items in 3 hours. And this is why, with Agile, you might do some projections based on those story points, but you only commit to what's going into an iteration, and you don't necessarily commit to it coming out of that iteration. You may make a commitment to a finished product. I'm going to, your house is going to be organized, but exactly what that means for exactly when is not determined right at the beginning, and I'm going to show you why. And this is where Agile becomes very useful. The master plan, what you're finding is actually figuring out what needs to be done takes longer with this client than you usually see, although the actual organizing is just organizing. So that's why it's taking a little longer. And the other thing is you give the client homework, things that she's supposed to finish before you come back the next time, but that's not happening. Therefore, you're estimating your story points are going to change, right? Because it's just going to take more time. She's not finishing up things in between. So things that you assumed would be done before you come back aren't. So you roll that all into your process and your estimating process. And this is exactly what you do for any other kind of project with this. And you're also finding that this client's a little quirky. And so you're starting to add user stories, and that's fine because you can communicate that with the client. You can say, this is a little different than usual. We're going to have to address this thing, right? You have herbs hanging from your ceiling. We've got to figure out what we're going to do with that. And so this makes a really good discussion point with whomever you are building the product for. They're able to see what you're doing, why it's taking how long, and help you make decisions about what's important along the way. But you find out after the first session, you're able to predict what you'll get done with some certainty. And this is what happens with Agile, is that velocity gets nailed down a bit after you try things. And as I said before, you don't give an end date for anything except what you think you're going to finish in the next session. Because that backlog could change at any moment. So she could decide she wants different things done. Conditions change. And in fact, conditions do change with this client. After the kitchen, your next plan is the office. That's how your backlog is ordered. Office stuff is going to be next. But while you're still finishing up the kitchen, you're still in an iteration with the kitchen, your client gets news that her in-laws are going to be coming for a visit, and the guest room is full of boxes and stuff. So she's got nowhere to put her in-laws. So you see your priority has changed. You may not have all those user stories defined yet, but you have an epic for guest room organization. So now you're going to define those user stories, get them ordered at the top of the backlog, and start them when you come in next. So you see how flexible this is. If the in-laws are going to arrive before you can get everything done, you have two choices, right? You can schedule more sessions because there's only one of you. You could bring in an assistant. In a software development world, that would mean you're going to add engineers or add QA if that's possible. You're going to schedule more sessions. That's possible because there's time to schedule more sessions, right? You have the rest of the week, and if you have time available. And what that might mean in a development environment is that you've added engineers, or if you have engineers who are working on more than one project, which is not supposed to happen in Agile, but in the real world it does, maybe the other project is less important and you assign them here. Okay, so so that's pretty much it in a nutshell as far as Agile. You can see that there's a progression as you start it. So if you're going to start on an Agile project, don't get discouraged. The first iteration, you don't really know anything. You don't know how it works. You don't know how fast people work. Typically, your team is not really familiar with the Agile process. They're probably quite familiar with the tasks that they're performing, but the way they perform them with not being able to change and not taking on 6 different tasks at once and working on whatever they feel like working on, having to go in priority order, those things are a little harder for people to work on and get together. So give it a little time. Now, this is a very quick overview of something that takes a little while to get used to. So let's walk through the things that you really want to remember about this. And you can email me if you want some resources. There are some resources, some Agile books on my website. The first is that Agile is an iterative process. So you don't do all the requirements for what you want to go out the door, at the beginning and then start work. You build. It comes in a lot of flavors, and the process itself is Agile. Sometimes people get very locked into the rules for Agile. You need to follow the rules, but if they're not working for you, you change them. You build the Agile process that works for your environment. Breaking the requirements down into small pieces is very, very important. Those user stories are the backbone of Agile, and you want to get good at breaking them into the right size pieces. I'm going to call for questions in a minute, but I just want to walk through the process again with you very quickly, and I don't have the slides up for this, but if you have subscribed to this, you'll get the slides so you can follow back through them. The Agile process is this. You have a kickoff for an iteration. An iteration is a fixed period of time that you're going to work on a fixed set of requirements. Iterations in the software world typically run between 1 and 4 weeks, but for whatever project you're on, they're all the same length. So let's say 2 weeks. You have a 2-week iteration. You have a backlog of user stories. Those are all your requirements broken into bite-sized pieces, and they're kept in a priority order in the backlog. That priority order can be changed at any time. More user stories can be added. User stories can be taken out of the backlog. The backlog is very flexible. At the beginning of an iteration, you have a kickoff meeting. You take the top priority user stories from the backlog, as many of them as will fit into your iteration based on your velocity. You move them in. You get people started on the first one in priority order that they're going to work on. You talk about any process issues and any process changes, and then you send everybody off to work. Everybody works in priority order for the length of the iteration, and every day you meet for a daily stand-up meeting that's 15 minutes or less. At the end of the iteration, you have a wrap-up meeting where people demonstrate what they've finished, where you decide what to do with the user stories that are left over, where you load up the next iteration, and then you start again. And you can, at the end of every iteration, you have a demonstrable product. You may not want to put that product out in the market, but you can demonstrate it. It is a finished product of some order. Therefore, you can choose to release any or all iterations. That's pretty much it in a nutshell. A lot of pieces in between, a lot of things to try. There are a lot of resources out there to help you, but that's the basics of how Agile works. So do you have any questions? Okay, so the question is, can you combine Agile and waterfall methodologies for a single project? Typically not. They are kind of diametrically opposed processes. The closest that really they come to working together is if you have a spiral methodology, waterfall methodology that we've talked about before. Do I recommend doing Agile for a whole organization at once? Depends on the size of the organization. Usually I like to start with a pilot product for any established organization so that we can work out the kinks. The growing pains are small and people can see pretty quickly what the advantages are when they're not overwhelmed by a large change. And it will slide into any organization reasonably easily. I've done this in a lot of organizations. It's really not too tough to start up a single project and see how it goes. Any other questions? Okay, so some best practices for teams that aren't co-located. That depending on the size of the teams, you may or may not be able to have everybody or want to have everybody in on the daily stand-up call, but you definitely need to have a daily stand-up call in each location with either recording or the notes from the stand-up call distributed to all of the locations for the team. I usually keep an open Skype group with all of the team members. So as people come in and out of time zones and type in and they're having their discussions on a rolling medium, basically. So this is not Skype voice, this is Skype text, and everybody can get in and see it as they come into their time zones. And I've used this kind of communication methodology for even projects that are worldwide, that have components in the United States, in Western Europe, in Eastern Europe, and in Asia. We've been able to roll through using that. And your wrap-up and kickoff meetings a lot of times are not going to be at fixed times as they are when everybody is in the same time zone. A lot of times they will be, you'll change them from iteration to iteration so that someone is getting enough sleep when they're in these meetings. So you use really the same kind of communication things that you want to use for any project that spans multiple time zones. It's just that you need to use them much more frequently, and you need to enforce that use. Any two people who sit down and have a meeting, if they're not doing it via this Skype thing, usually you want them to send out some notes from the meeting. Those notes can be 3 sentences. You know, what did we discuss? What did we decide? Just so that everyone stays on the same page, because what did we discuss? What did we decide? When everybody is sitting in the same room is pretty easy to keep track of. When people are sitting in, different places in the world, maybe not so easy. So really, it's establish your communication practices, make sure that everyone is sticking to them. Okay. Well, thank you all. That's all of the webinar programs. We'll continue to have the series up there where you can purchase the whole series, and then I have Q&A sessions for those series. But we'll rerun them later in 2016. We'll be rerunning the series. A lot of more information is on ivyBay.com, and I hope to talk to you again. Thanks.